The birth of the tyrant. The story of Shah Abbas begins with smoke. Not the incense of holy shrines or the steam that curls above the tea of courtiers, but the black, rolling smoke of burning towns and frightened men. He was born in 1571 in the city of Herat, far from the marble domes of Isfahan that would one day bear his name. Persia in those days was a fractured mirror, its reflection shattered by tribal feuds, its throne a seat of trembling uncertainty. Abbas grew up hearing that mercy is a luxury for the dead. His father, the half-blind and indecisive Muhammad Qutbanda, was king in name, but a puppet in the hands of the Qizilbash lords. They ruled their provinces like wolves, guarding separate flocks. In those fractured courts, the young prince learned to smile when he wished to strike and to whisper when he wanted to live. The tutors who dared to soften him were replaced. The servants who gossiped were found strangled behind the stables. Fear was his first companion, and power his only prayer. When Abbas reached 16, he struck. With the help of Murshid Khan, a ruthless mentor who saw in the boy the spark of destiny, he overthrew his father's court and declared himself king. The coronation was brief and cold. In the palace of Kazvin, torches hissed in the rain as the new Shah swore that no man, no tribe, no bloodline would ever again dictate to the crown. By sunrise, the executions began. The Qizilbash chieftains were called to feast and flattery. Wine was poured, drums were beaten, and when the last toast was raised, Abbas's guards entered the hall. The music stopped with the first scream. Heads rolled across the tiled floor like overturned goblets, and the blood ran in narrow crimson streams between the mosaics. Those who survived the purge understood the message. The age of compromise was dead. From that night forward, Persia moved by fear. Governors sent gifts of gold and concubines to prove loyalty. Mothers silenced their sons for speaking the Shah's name aloud. Abbas rode through the provinces surrounded by his new corps of Ghulam's Christian captives, taken from the Caucasus, trained to fight, and forbidden to remember the homes from which they came. He spoke to them in a voice soft enough to chill the bone. Abbas began to cleanse his lineage. His brothers were accused of conspiracy, perhaps truly, perhaps not. Each was summoned, embraced, and then led away. The blinding knives were heated until they glowed orange, the eyes taken swiftly so the blood would not stain the beard. Those mutilated princes were paraded before the courtiers as living warnings, their sockets bound in white linen. The Shah's smile never faltered. He spoke of divine justice and the necessity of order. Soon the prisons overflowed. Men of learning, merchants accused of treason, even poets whose verses hinted at rebellion all, vanished into the dungeons beneath the royal citadel. Some reappeared as corpses hung from the city gates. Others were left in chains to rot, their bones whitening in the damp air. Abbas ruled not merely through punishment, but through spectacle. In Isfahan squares, the condemned were executed as theater. Drummers announced each sentence, and the people gathered as if to witness a festival. One thief had his hand nailed to a post before the crowd. Another was flayed from shoulder to heel, while a herald proclaimed the Shah's mercy. The sound of the knife against flesh became the rhythm of obedience. Yet the Shah saw himself not as cruel, but as chosen. God made me the shepherd of this land, he declared, and the wolves must fear the shepherd's staff. In private, however, his dreams were restless. He saw his father's blind eyes in the dark and heard whispers of betrayal in every corner of the palace. Asterisk Chapter 1. The Blood Crown. Snow lay like a shroud over Kazvin, the winter he took the throne, a clean white that could not disguise the blood beneath. The palace lamps hissed in the cold, and the corridors smelled of tallow and steel. He entered with a face that gave nothing away. The cautious boy turned to stone, and the guards who had once laughed at his youth lowered their eyes. The blind king was led aside without ceremony. No one wept. In a city trained by years of betrayal, silence passed for consent. The new Shah did not announce mercy. He announced the order, and everyone understood what that meant. Messengers rode in every direction, carrying sealed decrees that opened like knives in provincial courts. Chiefs who had ruled like little kings were summoned to Qazvin for reconciliation. The feast was generous, the music stately. When the cups were raised for loyalty, the doors closed. The first scream cracked the ceremony like a jar dropped on tile. By dawn, carpets were soaked dark, and the names of old families were spoken in the past tense. It was not simply execution. It was a demonstration. He was teaching the realm a new language in which obedience spoke through fear. Outside the palace, townspeople woke to a sky the color of iron and a whisper moving through the markets that everything had changed. In the barracks, the Shah walked among soldiers and asked for names that mattered, men who stirred dislike as much as they inspired allegiance. He learned quickly and punished quicker. A general who had held the treasury hostage one season too long was escorted onto the square at noon. His sentence was not shouted, it was recited as if part of prayer. When the blade fell, the crowd did not cheer. They watched with the stillness of people who knew their own lives balanced on someone else's breath. He turned the city into a stage and gave it lessons in terror. Thieves who had once bribed their way free now found their pleas carried no weight. Their bodies were hung along the approaches to the capital, where caravans would see them first. Governors returning from the audience with the Shah learned to keep their hands from trembling as they passed beneath the gates, for the dead seemed to look down and count the living. In the chancery, scribes copied decrees that bled the old tribal privileges out of the law. In the royal kitchens, the meat was carved thin, the way men who have seen too much violence take small bites to keep steady dot at court. He dispensed favor with the same calm he brought to punishment. A man promoted in the morning could disappear by nightfall. The lesson was not subtle, and it did not need to be. Fealty now belonged to the crown alone. The old pacts of the Kizilbash, tied by marriage and sworn oaths, cracked under the weight of a king who trusted nothing that did not stand trembling before him. Rival princes were invited to reconciliation in a quiet chamber lit with perfumed lamps. There were embraces and tears that smelled of rosewater. When the curtains closed, the physicians arrived with bowls of snow to cool the irons. Blinding was a sentence and also a message. The princes lived, and they would live long enough to be seen, a reminder that sight and power had been severed by the same hand. Word of these ceremonies traveled faster than the official chronicles. Tavern talk was careful. Mothers touched their sons' faces as if counting the features they might one day have to identify. In the mosques, preachers praised the return of discipline, but their sermons bent around a tremor that even the pious could hear. The Shah did not need their approval, only their voices. He attended punishments in disguise, a habit he cultivated like a private devotion. Standing shoulder to shoulder with cobblers and water sellers, he watched what fear did to a crowd. He watched how quickly silence spread, how averted eyes were as good as praise. He appointed new captains who owed him everything and nothing else. Many were boys whose accents betrayed a foreign origin. Captives raised inside Persian walls until loyalty replaced memory. Their presence in the streets was an omen. The city learned the shuffle of their boots and the clipped rhythm of their commands. In the first weeks, the prisons were filled with men who had believed that yesterday's protections extended into today. The Shah kept the corridors bright and the cells dark, and between them stretched a system that moved without squeal or slack. The chronicler who wrote of it later called it a machine of dictatorship. The word was anachronistic and exactly right. The executions continued until they were no longer an event but a weather pattern. When a noble was taken, his wives sent for the washerwomen without being told. When a merchant was seized for treason, the apprentices in his shop put away the account books and began wrapping inventory for auction. A city acclimates quickly when it must. Men learn to sleep without dreams and awake without questions. The Shah's courtiers perfected the art of saying nothing that could be repeated. Through it all, he remained controlled. Not a butcher dancing over spoils, but a magistrate weighing lives against the balance of a state he believed threatened. He told himself and anyone brave enough to listen that Persia had been dying of softness. If he bled it now, he bled it to cure it when spring came. Markets reopened fully, and the caravan bells sounded like relief. Yet beneath the ordinary chatter ran a new river of caution. The teenager who had seized a crown had given the empire its first gift, a state of peace assembled from the bones of those who might have said no. The second gift would be larger and darker, for the king had discovered how easily a nation could be persuaded to live inside a silence of his making. Chapter 2. The Purge of Bloodlines. The palace that Abbas inherited was filled with ghosts who still breathed. Every cousin, uncle, or half-brother was a shadow at the edge of the throne room, each one a reminder that the crown was not yet secure. He walked among them smiling, memorizing faces as a huntsman studies the paths of his prey. To rule Persia, he told himself, he must end the family that had made him. The first to vanish was a cousin whose only crime was charm. He was summoned at night for counsel and never left the audience hall. The next morning, the corridors were scrubbed, and the courtiers spoke in low voices about an honorable exile. It was the beginning of a vocabulary of lies that would grow rich and precise over the years. Exile for imprisonment, illness for execution, piety for disappearance. The Kizilbash commanders understood what was happening, but they did not resist. They had seen how quickly favor could change. They had seen the scaffold being built before it was used. When Abbas called them to swear new oaths, they came with trembling hands and offered their sons as pages to prove loyalty. In their eyes, he saw what he wanted to see: fear. It tasted like obedience. In the women's quarters, the air turned thin with dread. The widows of dead princes gathered their children close, teaching them silence as prayer. At night, the corridors echoed with the shuffle of guards sent to escort another relative to questioning. Some returned pale and wordless. Others did not return at all. Servants learned to avoid meeting one another's eyes. To speak a name too loudly was to invite its erasure. The Shah's paranoia grew in perfect symmetry with his authority. He could not eat unless a trusted eunuch tasted the food first. He slept in a different room each night, convinced that daggers waited beneath the pillows. In council, he watched every gesture, every intake of breath. When ministers flattered him, he wondered what they concealed. When they hesitated, he saw treason. The court chronicler recorded that the king's silences were longer than his speeches, and more dangerous. One by one, his remaining brothers were called before him. He greeted them kindly, offered sweet sherbet, and spoke of reconciliation. Those who had served him faithfully were told they would be rewarded. The courtiers present later said that Abbas's eyes never left their faces, as if measuring what the future would look like without them. When the audience ended, the brothers were escorted away to safekeeping. A week later, a chronicler noted that the line of succession had become mercifully clear. Within months, the palace had changed its rhythm. No laughter carried from the gardens. Musicians played softer, and the dancers avoided meeting the king's gaze. He walked the colonnades at dusk, his steps echoing against stone, a solitary figure surrounded by the emptiness he had ordered. When he passed, officials bowed so deeply that they could not see what followed behind him. The attendants carrying sealed letters that named the next to fall. Abbas told his clerics that blood must be spilled, so the roots of the dynasty would hold. They nodded and recited verses about divine justice, and when the sentences were carried out, they wrote that the king had restored God's order. Outside the palace, the people repeated the same words because repetition was safer than doubt. They said the royal family was being purified, that sin was being burned away. But even as they spoke, they watched their own doors at night, wondering if purity was contagious. When the purges ended, there was no family left large enough to threaten him. The halls that had once echoed with quarrels and laughter were quiet. In that quiet lay the logic of his reign. He had replaced love with fear, kinship with distance, memory with obedience. He had made himself the only living branch on a tree he had cut down with his own hands. And yet, when he looked out across the city from the palace roof, he saw the smoke of evening fires rising in the same calm spirals as before. The world had not changed, only its ruler. The bloodline was secure, but the man who carried it felt smaller each day, as though the ghosts he had created were pressing close, whispering their names against his ear. Chapter 3. The Empire of Slaves. They said the mountains swallowed voices in the Caucasus, that a cry could rise against the cliffs and return as nothing but wind. Abbas rode there believing in echoes. He wanted his will to bounce from ridge to ridge and fall as law on every village roof. The wars that took him north were framed as necessity, a belt tightening around the empire's waist. What he sought, he told his council, was security. What he collected was people. The armies moved like a shadow's second hand, steady and unhurried. Scouts went ahead to count hearths and wells. Scribes followed to count bodies. Behind them came the detachments that turned counting into capture. The first villages fell in fog, bells muffled, doors forced, animals driven into ravines so no one could flee on horseback. The prayer songs of dawn were drowned under shouted orders. Men were bound in pairs and placed at the front of each column as a guarantee that the rest would follow. The old and the very young were pushed into churchyards and told to pray. Those who could walk were told to walk. The king did not call it enslavement. He called it relocation, a gentler word that meant the same thing once the boots started marching. Families were broken by arithmetic. 2 strong brothers taken for the barracks, a clever boy marked for the palace schools, a handful of daughters drafted into the households of officers who would not refuse what the campaign offered. Scribes inked each name as if tallying sacks of grain. The language of the record books stayed calm even when the road did not. The passes were narrow, the air thin enough to sting the lungs. Columns of captives wound through the stone like threads pulled from a torn garment. The king's horse climbed deliberately, hooves ringing, and he paused often to look back. What he saw pleased him, the precise geometry of subjugation, lines that held their shape under hunger and fear. If a man stumbled, the line closed over him. If someone tried to run, the line tightened and the lesson moved on. The mountains learned those lessons quickly. There is a kind of silence that is not peace but exhaustion. The valleys wore it like a bruise. By the time the snowmelt swelled the rivers, tens of thousands were already on the move toward Persia. They were herds without pasture, roads without destination. At way stations, the soldiers counted again, correcting the losses with fresh seizures from villages still trailing smoke. The columns met and merged, a slow confluence of grief, and then poured south onto the high plains. A few priests tried to bless the people as they marched. A few elders asked to speak with commanders. The answers were patient and empty. The king sought not counsel, but compliance. When the first arrivals reached Isfahan, the city turned its face to the spectacle. People lined the arcades to see the captives pass, to examine the fair hair of the Highlanders and the dark eyes of their children. The square that would one day be praised for its beauty bore witness to the ceremony of renaming. Boys were separated and given new identities that wrapped them in the Shah's favor while stripping away their past. They learned Persian words before they learned to sleep, standing at attention until their knees trembled, repeating titles and articles of faith until the old prayers rusted from their tongues. The barracks where they were kept were clean in the way kitchens are clean when the fire is hot. Each morning began with drills that replaced hesitation with reflex. The staff officers praised quiet, quick obedience. The boys were blank slates only for a moment. Once the writing began, it never stopped. They learned to maintain muskets and bows, to march at night without a lantern, to hold their bodies at rest so completely that even fear could not find a muscle to claim. They were told that the king had lifted them out of heathen darkness. They were told that they were special, that they now belonged to the only family that could not betray them. That family had a name, and soon the empire learned it well. Ghulams, the slave soldiers whose loyalty was a matter of design. They rose through ranks created for them, ranks that bypassed the old tribal nobility like a river cutting a new bed. The Qizilbash chiefs watched and understood too late. Their power had been diluted into this new alloy of strangers turned instruments. The Ghulams guarded gates, commanded regiments, carried sealed letters that could unmake a governor in a morning. They learned to pray from the clerics the Shah trusted and to speak in the clipped court, Persian of men who knew their fate stood on a single man's breath. The king found in them what he could not find in his kin, a reflection that did not flinch. He walked the parade grounds at dusk as they practiced formations, squares that dilated and contracted with a surgeon's precision. He praised them with the same measured tone he used to condemn others. Those who pleased him were rewarded with robes and stipends, and most of all, with permission to forget. Forgetting was a salary, paid each day they did not speak their old names. The flow of bodies did not stop. Campaign followed campaign, and with each return, the caravans of captives grew. In Georgia, the vineyards were left untended. In Circassia, the mountain paths filled with little cairns that marked where someone had fallen and could not be carried. In the Armenian towns, the markets flickered and went dark. Their merchants counted as assets and transferred like ledgers to the palace quarter the Shah was building for them. He intended to make wealth obedient as well. When the captives protested that they were tradesmen, not soldiers, that their hands were taught to weigh silk, not weapons, he nodded and said that a kingdom needs both. He set them to work under watch. The new districts took shape with unsettling speed. In Isfahan, a neighborhood of displaced Armenians, grew in carefully ordered streets, each house allotted as if the king were drawing a map inside his own skull. The city called it New Julfa and congratulated itself on its cosmopolitan splendor. Under the painted beams, families ate in silence, their windows opening onto a river that reminded them of another river that had not forgiven them. On holy days, they prayed in churches built at the Shah's permission, and for that permission, they offered silk as tithe. Across the river, the ghulems trained and prayed in their own quarter, and sometimes on a still night, the chants of one community reached the ears of the other. Both had been moved by the same hand and repurposed for the same design. The design was elegant in the way traps are elegant. It did not require constant effort once it closed. The king had added a new pillar to his state, one that bore weight without complaint. The pillar had a heartbeat, a memory that was being sanded down by the daily abrasion of orders obeyed. Not all resistance failed. There were skirmishes along the frontiers, brief uprisings in garrisons where the mountain dialect resurfaced in a cry and a stolen saber. The commanders put them down without noise. They preferred punishment that traveled by rumor rather than proclamation. A detachment would enter a village at dusk and leave before dawn, and in the morning, the people would find that a particular family was missing. No lists, no public scaffold, just the knowledge that something had been measured and found wanting. The court chroniclers, who understood season from season that their ink was a form of oath, recorded the campaigns as triumphs. They wrote about roads made safe again, about caravans moving without fear of bandits, about fortresses restored. Their lines bent around the absence at the center of their story. A people turned into a resource. Once, one of them allowed himself a detail, a small honesty tucked into a paragraph about logistics. He wrote that the soldiers sang as they marched, and that the captives did not. The phrase was copied as written, and then never again. By the end of that decade, the empire's surface had been rattled. Provinces that once flared in revolt now held their breath. The borderlands paid taxes in coin and in children. The palace had a steady supply of boys who would become captains, chamberlains, couriers, and of men who would become examples when an example was needed. The king visited the barracks less frequently, reassured by their predictability. He had wanted a body that would move when he thought, and he had built one. In the markets of Isfahan, buyers learned to recognize the accent of a man who had arrived under escort. It carried a careful courtesy and a distance that did not invite questions. In the evening, when the call to prayer braided with the cries of water sellers and the lowing of cattle on the road to the southern gate, the city sounded complete, a tapestry without loose threads. Only those who listened too long could hear the scrape beneath the weave, the steady, tireless sound of a new foundation settling into place, the shuffle of drilled feet, the welts of old names being worn smooth, the breath of a king who had decided that a person could be remade by the pressure of his will and the passage of time. He had become the architect of a nation that no longer knew where it had been built. The stone came from different quarries, the timber from different forests, but the house was his. When visitors marveled that his subjects seemed to move as one, he smiled with a quiet satisfaction that did not reach his eyes. In those eyes lived the memory of the mountains and the echo he had chased there, the sound a human being makes when taken out of the world he knows. The echo had not faded. It had been arranged into cadence, set to the drumbeat of marching, broken into syllables of orders obeyed. The empire called it harmony. The captives called it night. Chapter 4. The March of the Vanished. They left at dawn because dawn is a time that forgives nothing. The light arrives honest and indifferent, and in that clarity, the long lines could be seen for what they were. A nation unspooling at the command of one man. The soldiers called it relocation and spoke the word as if it were a blessing. The people called it leaving, and the word broke in the mouth like dry bread. From the high valleys to the river meadows, roads filled with footsteps that did not choose their direction. The departures were organized with the calm of clerks. A scribe on a stool with a ledger. A captain with an iron rod to mark door lintels. A pair of soldiers counted bodies inside each house and decided which bodies would move. The decisions felt like weather, impersonal and inevitable. A family of 7 became a file of 5 without any argument that could change a mind. The old were told to stay with a promise of return that no one believed. Those who begged for another day to gather grain or to find a missing child were given a shrug and a gesture toward the road. Delay was treated not as mercy, but as suspicion. The march began with the sound of cooking pots. Women tied them to bundles of bedding and hung gourds of water from loops of cord. Men carried whatever tools might be bartered along the way. Little by little, the familiar weight of home gave way to the unfamiliar weight of flight. The soldiers encouraged pace with a rhythm of orders that never rose to a shout. And because their voices were steady, the captives learned to keep their protests steady too, keeping anger and grief trapped behind the teeth until both turned to a single taste of metal. The land marked them as they went. In the forests, the air smelled of resin and damp bark. On the open stretches, it smelled of dust and the iron heat of stones. Children asked questions until the questions became repetition and then silence. On narrow paths, the file compressed, and the breath of the man behind was a fact of life. If someone stumbled, the file flowed around him and rejoined like water around a rock. When the path widened again, the gap remained like a missing tooth. Commanders preferred the appearance of order. No whips, no galloping horses, just the long animal of the column moving with a will that looked like consent from a distance. At the halts, guards set a perimeter, and the lines bent into rough circles that suggested community. Fires were permitted only at dusk, and even then they were small, patched together from damp twigs that made more smoke than heat. The smoke carried the recipe of the march: green wood. Wool singed as a blanket strayed too close. Thin porridge that never thickened enough to satisfy the mouth. Now and then a priest or mullah walked along the edges, their books wrapped in cloth to keep out the dust. They spoke the words they knew, and the words did what they always do: comforted some, angered others, and reminded most that heaven had a different sense of time than earth. The soldiers did not interfere with prayer so long as it did not interfere with counting. At each stop, the scribes added columns of names, true lines through names that would not need food in the morning, and balanced the page with a precision that did not care whether it measured bowls or livestock. There were villages along the route that watched the process with the same uneasy patience used for floods. Doors stayed closed until the soldiers had passed. Then they opened to offer a ladle of water, a rope for tying a broken sandal, a few dates palmed into a child's hand, with a look that said, "Don't thank me," where someone can hear. Hospitality became a form of resistance too small to punish, too stubborn to extinguish. Word traveled ahead. Boil water, keep daughters inside, hide what can be hidden in the rafters. Word traveled behind. The column is larger than yesterday. The column is hungry, the column is coming. When winter threatened, the commanders selected a lower road and the pace increased. Speed was its own cruelty. Ankles swelled, shoulders burned, thoughts narrowed to the next bend, the next stream, the next rumor of a town where a baker might exchange bread for a ring. Rings disappeared one by one, then the bracelets, then the family spoons that had outlasted 3 generations of quarrels. In their place, the marchers collected other things. A rhythm for conserving breath, a way of folding grief small enough to carry, a knowledge of which soldiers looked away and which did not thought there were births. There are always births, even in a season of endings. Women held up blankets as walls. Midwives did what midwives have always done, and the column learned to slow for 1 hour and then become a column again. There were deaths that took the same amount of time. A man lay down beside the road, and the circle around him closed exactly as if it were a birth, then opened and moved on. The ground kept its secrets. A river must be crossed. There is always a river. The bridge was narrow and old, its boards too far apart, the water noisy with the certainty of downstream. Soldiers spaced the crossings with care, and still there were accidents. A sound that follows a slip is not a shout, but the small surprise of air being taken. The column paused. The column breathed. The column resumed its cadence with a new lesson in its bones about how quickly a life can become a ripple dot in the lowlands, the heat flattened thought. Dust lifted off the road at midday and coated tongues until language became gesture. The scribes wrapped their ledgers in oiled leather. The guards tied wet cloths around their heads, and the captives discovered that weariness could live alongside wakefulness, like 2 tenants sharing a wall. At night, when the air cooled, some remembered songs and found that singing was forbidden only if it gathered a crowd. So they sang so quietly that only the people nearest could hear. And in that near circle, the march briefly resembled a village again. News reached them by rumor. The king had promised land. The king had promised work. The king had promised protection. The promises varied by mouth, as promises do, and yet they produced the same obedience because the alternatives were so few. What the captives understood clearly was this: they would arrive somewhere, and at that somewhere, they would be measured again. Their houses would be measured by width and sunlight, their labor by skill, their faith by who watched them worship. They rehearsed their new names without moving their lips. On the approach to the capital, the road widened and straightened, as if the land itself had been taught posture. Crowds gathered under the arcades to watch the arrival. A woman in a saffron shawl counted the children in each cluster and whispered a number to the woman beside her. A merchant examined faces with a professional eye that reduced suffering to capacities. That boy would make a fine page. That man's hands would take well to the loom. That girl has a voice the court might pay to hear. The column learned another lesson. That arrival is only another word for assessment. They were led through new streets the king had made for such arrivals. Houses with comfortable proportions, wells at regular intervals, a church permitted and placed where it could be admired and surveilled in the same glance. The king had arranged their future with the same neatness he brought to war. He had calculated that despair would slow production, so he permitted the habit to grow again, just enough to bear fruit. In the mornings, the quarter would hum like any other, with brooms at doorsteps and water sloshing from jars. In the evenings, the hum would settle into a hush repaired by prayer. Every week an official would walk the lanes with a book and a pen, To ensure that the hush remained a hush, those who were designated for the barracks did not reach these streets. They were turned aside at a gate where the air changed a faint tang of oil, the clean scrape of whetstones, the smell of wool uniforms drying on lines. They learned a different city, a city of squares and shouted numbers. And soon their footsteps matched those numbers with a certainty that felt at first like pain, and then like pride, and finally like forgetfulness. The barracks taught them that forgetting could be a place to live. Back in the quarter, the merchants reopened their ledgers with hands that shook the first week and steadied by the second. Silk answered to skill no matter the city. The king took his share and praised their industry in public, while the tax assessors counted in private with a rigor that left no margin for sorrow. The people adapted because people do. They married at the new pace, buried at the new pace, taught their children the new geography of safety. They did not speak of the road. They did not need to. The road spoke through them whenever they fell silent. Years later, a traveler asked an old woman whether she missed the place she had come from. She answered that memory is a field with poor soil. What you plant there grows stunted and bitter. She said the king had turned their lives into a canal, and that a canal is not a river, but it carries water just the same. When the traveler pressed, she looked down the lane at the open doors and the thin line of smoke beyond, and said only that the march had not ended. It had changed its gait. If he listened at dusk, he could still hear the feet. The policy had a simple brilliance and a long echo. The marshes continued in smaller waves whenever trouble rose at the edges of the map. Chapter 5. The Fires of Julfa. The king called it strategy. The people called it an ending. The year was 1604. When the order went out from Isfahan, the frontier must be cleared. The Ottomans were advancing, and Shah Abbas would not leave them a city to claim. His map showed the valley of the Aras River as a buffer to be emptied. Julfa lay there, prosperous and complacent, its merchants famous for silk, its churches glittering with gilt icons. They had trusted their distance from war. They did not yet understand what it meant to be useful to a frightened king. The decree arrived with ceremony, a seal pressed in cinnabar, a flourish of signatures, the assurance that this was salvation. Within days the soldiers followed, moving through the streets as politely as fire through dry grass. They read the edict in the square and told the people that the evacuation would be temporary. They lied with an ease that made the lie feel merciful. By nightfall, wagons were being loaded, doors barred from outside, and the smell of pitch crept through the alleys. Abbas stood on a rise above the city as the columns began to form. His advisors said he watched quietly, arms folded, counting not men but merchandise. The Armenians were his finest traders. Their exile would enrich him once they were resettled inside the heart of the empire, where their wealth could be supervised. Behind him, courtiers murmured about divine will, about cleansing and preservation. None dared say the word that fit best. Scorched. The march began under a sky as pale as ash. Bells from the churches rang in uneven rhythms until the soldiers silenced them with hammers. Families clutched icons, documents, the keys to houses they would never see again. The river waded to the north, wide and fast from autumn rains. On its far bank, engineers had built pontoon bridges to speed the crossing. The bridges were new, the wood unseasoned. They groaned beneath the weight of carts and animals, of hope stacked higher than prudence. When the first span gave way, it happened quietly, a plank sliding, a rope snapping, the sound almost tender. Then came the rush of water and the cries that followed it down. The soldiers shouted for order, for discipline, for God's mercy. But none of those things could float by the second day. The air reeked of smoke and the sour tang of wet wool. Those still on the near bank saw Julfa burning. The king had ordered the torching of the town so that nothing usable would remain for the enemy. Flames leapt from roof to roof with a precision that looked rehearsed. The silk warehouses went up first, then the merchant halls, then the low houses along the riverfront where cats and children hid together. The smoke flattened the sky. Witnesses later said it smelled of pepper and vinegar, the sharp stinging scent of everything familiar. Turning to gas. Abbas did not turn away. A chronicler who rode behind him recorded that the king's face was calm, that he remarked upon the efficiency of his captains. He spoke of loss as one speaks of a balance sheet. To destroy a city in order to save an empire, he said, was the kind of decision a weak man could never make. The chronicler wrote it down because he wanted to live. On the far shore, the refugees camped on black mud. They burned what they carried for warmth: tables, icons, crates of silk that had survived the fire. The wind changed and brought with it the smell of the city still burning, a smell that crawled into their hair and refused to leave. Mothers pressed cloth over their children's mouths to keep them from coughing up the taste of home. Some still believed the soldiers when they promised new houses in the capital. Others understood that a promise given by a man with a torch was not a promise meant to be kept. Weeks later, the survivors reached Isfahan, a procession of ghosts, trailing carts that creaked like confession. The Shah met them outside the walls beneath a canopy of embroidered silk. He spoke of destiny, of a new beginning, of a quarter he would build for them beside the river. He called it New Julfa. He promised safety, freedom of worship, and a future. The words sounded generous, and in a way they were. He needed their trade, their skill with dies and ledgers, the grace with which they made profit bloom even in ruin. The Armenians bowed because bowing was the only currency left to them. New Julfa rose quickly. Streets straight as calculations, houses measured to hold obedience. Churches were built again, their bells smaller, their towers low enough that they could not be seen from the royal bridge. From across the water, the king could hear the bells faintly, like memory diluted by distance. He congratulated himself on his mercy. He had spared their faith. He told the mullahs and turned it into an ornament for his city. He told the merchants of Isfahan that they now lived beside the most diligent people in the world. He did not mention that diligence born of fear is a quiet sort of slavery. Travelers who came later saw only the result: neat workshops, prosperous markets, the glitter of commerce in the sun. They wrote home about the tolerance of the Persian king who let Christians thrive under his protection. None of them walked the road from the ruins to the capital. None of them knew how silence can survive fire. The Armenians did not correct them. They had learned that survival required a certain politeness toward lies. At night, the river reflected the lights of both cities, the old one gone, the new one thriving, and the reflection looked almost peaceful. The water moved between them without preference, carrying silt and ashes in equal measure. Children born in New Julfa grew up thinking of themselves as merchants of Isfahan, not exiles. Yet in the pauses of prayer, in the beat between words, something else lingered. The crackle of timbers, the weight of a bridge giving way, the echo of their own footsteps, leaving the only world they had known. The king's name hung above it all, radiant, unassailable, as if he had built not a quarter, but a monument to forgetting. Chapter 6. The Court of Eyes. The palace learned to hold its breath. It was not just the guards posted at every arch and turning, or the eunuchs who moved like polished hinges through the women's quarters, or the scribes bent over the knight's decrees until their wrists ached. It was the building itself, the long corridors of burnished plaster and blue tile, the courtyards where water trembled in shallow pools, the carved screens whose patterns made a net of light across the floors. The stone had the memory of footfalls and a new habit of silence. People spoke softly because echoes carried. They learned that even their own words sounded like witnesses. He walked those corridors as a man who has discovered that attention is a weapon. He could feel it when he entered a room. The way spines straightened, hands hid their tremors. The air thinned around any mention of succession. The king had long ago convinced himself that the greatest danger lay in the men closest to him, and so proximity became punishment. Ministers found that intimacy with power was not safety but exposure. They avoided the honor of walking beside him in the gardens because the questions he asked, they were never harmless. These were not inquiries in search of advice. They were nets cast for hesitation, small catches that could be dried into accusations by morning. He cultivated a style of listening that felt like an examination. When someone spoke, he did not nod or interrupt. He watched the mouth as if the body itself were a confession. If a voice rose at the end of a sentence, or if an honorific arrived half a heartbeat late, the error was recorded in a part of his brain that had become ledger and tribunal both. Those who survived learned to keep their answers smooth and regular, as if speech itself were a drill. The old ease of court life banter, innuendo, laughter that bent too near gossip fell away. What remained was a choreography of care in which no one touched, no one trusted, and everyone rehearsed humility. The way soldiers rehearse arms dot at night, the palace changed its register. Torches burned low. The blue in the tiles retreated into darkness, and in the soft light, faces looked disembodied, as if drifting at the level of the lamps. This was the hour of escorts, when a chamberlain would approach a seated minister with a bow too deep to be ordinary and a request too polite to be refused. The man would rise, straighten his robe, and follow. In the morning, his office would be swept, his papers boxed and sealed with the royal stamp, and the corridor outside would be washed with vinegar. The story told to the city was that he had retired to a holy place to consider the vanity of this world. The palace learned to accept such pieties because the other words were more dangerous to say. The interrogations did not need spectacle. The room was small, the attendants few, and the questions precise. They were questions that did not look for truth, but for fracture. What did you hear in the market? Why did you delay the order? Who attends your prayers? The room was patient, and the night was long. What the palace remembered were not cries, but the sound of breath steadying itself after too much fear. The slow recalibration of a man who has understood that there will be no argument to win, only a fate to meet without humiliation. When news of a confession reached the king, he read it as a physician reads a pulse, with interest and no surprise. Everything confirmed what he already knew, that loyalty was a theater, and that only terror worked behind the scenes. He made executions into lessons without turning them into riots. There were days when the square outside the palace held the scaffold, but more often The justice unfolded in rooms that could be wiped clean. The victims were not the poor. They were men whose deaths could reorganize a hierarchy at a single stroke. An accountant whose figures had displeased him. A provincial judge whose decisions suggested a preference for local chiefs. A captain whose letter had contained a phrase that implied an independent mind. The punishments were varied, tailored to the moral that needed teaching. When he wanted the court to remember that lineage offered no sanctuary, a prince was led away and returned altered in a manner that cut him from the line of succession like a clipped branch. When he wanted the clerics to understand that piety would not shield ambition, a sermon was read in absentia, while its author learned that doctrines, too, could be weighed and found wanting. The women's quarters had their own weather. The old consorts grew pale and thin, guardians of courtesies that no longer mattered. The younger ones learned to move with the economy of people who cannot risk chance. Servants looked from the floor to the hands they were serving and no farther. A dropped tray could end a family. A laugh at the wrong story could end a lineage. Eunuchs, whose allegiance was a function of proximity, became the safest and most dangerous men alive, passing messages between fear and favor, tipping the scales that decided who slept and who did not. They did not need to lie to be lethal. They only needed to repeat what had been said with the weight of their office behind it. That it was in this atmosphere that the king's sons became mirrors. He could not endure. The eldest, admired in the bazaars and the barracks, had a way of speaking to soldiers that made them listen as if they were equals. It was a gift that had always caused empires trouble. The father watched the son greet a group of officers one evening, saw the ease in their faces, and felt something like winter pass through him. Praise from the crowd meant a claim he could not permit. A summons followed. The court learned of the prince's death as it learned of other deaths, through a reshuffling of ceremonial roles and the careful erasure of his name from the week's petitions. Grief was performed in ways that satisfied the law and roused no curiosity. The trees in the palace garden kept their shade, and under that shade the younger princes learned a new lesson: to lower their eyes as if they had never owned them. Blinding was the ritual the court understood best. It was a sentence that promoted a kind of survival. The man lived, and his living advertised the king's mercy in a voice more persuasive than a sermon. He would be fed, housed, allowed to walk in the cool of the morning under supervision. He would be seen, and seeing him would remind everyone of the hinge on which their own fate swung. The eyes taken were not only those of the condemned. They were the eyes of the women who had borne him, the siblings who would not speak his name again, the servants who learned to step aside and pretend they did not hear the cane touch the stone floor as the ruined man passed. The palace was not a building with rooms. It was a network of gazes, and the king had learned how to unmake them one by one. He enjoyed disguise, because disguise taught him what fear looked like from the other side. He went out as a merchant, a pilgrim, a magistrate's clerk, and returned with the kind of news a sovereign trusts more than any report: the temperature of the crowd when it believes itself unwatched. He would stand at a coffee stall and hear a story told about a governor's cruelty, and he would decide whether the story was a spark to be crushed or a useful fire to be guided. Back at the palace, he kept a ledger of names that did not exist in any official archive. The names were a map of attention. When he traced the network with a finger, ministers disappeared. The chroniclers adapted. They understood that history had to be written in a grammar that spared the hand that wrote it. They learned to praise virtues that camouflaged crimes. When an uncle was removed, they spoke of God refining the dynasty. When a general was unmade, they celebrated the king's vigilance. The clerics were not spared. The ones who had ridden high on sermons that smelled of power discovered that the pulpit could turn to a trap under their feet. The king wanted religion to be a mirror that reflected his face without distortion, and any doctrine that cast a shadow was revised or removed. Public piety multiplied as private faith thinned. Men learned to recite with emphasis and to believe in silence, or not at all. The palace mosque filled at the right hours and emptied with the right murmur. A visitor could have thought devotion universal. Yet even in prayer, the posture of flinching remained. The faithful bowed as if dodging a blow dot. By now the court of eyes was more than a phrase. It was the way the world was kept in shape. Petitioners approached with petitions already edited of anything that could be misunderstood. Answers moved with measured grace, careful to display beauty without boldness. Painters avoided portraits whose gaze might be read as insolent. Musicians composed keys that suggested loyalty. The arts flourished with the brightness of plants grown in thin soil lovely to look at, shallow-rooted, quick to wither when the weather turned. The king admired them and took credit. He did not ask for their truth. He asked for their obedience, and art obeyed. He aged into this apparatus. The body tired, the temper shortened, the appetite for suspicion became the appetite itself. He still rode out at dawn sometimes to watch the soldiers practice, and for a few minutes the geometry of movement calmed him. But when he returned to the palace, the corridors felt longer, the doors heavier, the pools darker. He wanted to be remembered. He had ensured that he would be. The method was brutality. The memorial would be a silence held too long. Chapter 7. The Holy Terror. Morning in Isfahan arrived gentle, but the city had learned not to trust gentleness. The sunlight that caught the domes and painted the river gold was the same light that glinted off the blades of men who enforced belief. The empire that Shah Abbas had carved from war now demanded a purity that could only be proven through fear. Faith, like every other craft, was measured, regulated, inspected for flaws. The mosques were full. From the outside they seemed to breathe, great lungs of turquoise and smoke. Inside, the air was still, the silence between prayers thick as oil. Mullahs chosen by the king stood where the old clerics had stood and repeated his decrees with perfect cadence. Their voices carried across the courtyards and out into the alleys, promising mercy to the obedient and ruin to those who whispered another creed. In the cafes and markets, people began to repeat those words the way they repeated prices, automatically, without conviction, but with the precision Thathir's vivel required. Across the empire, minarets sprouted where churches and synagogues had once drawn the horizon. Not all at once, Abbas understood that devotion imposed too quickly breeds rebellion, but steadily, like a fever that rises unnoticed until the skin burns. The Christian and Jewish communities that had been tolerated for their usefulness now lived behind measured walls, their processions shortened, their songs confined to twilight. A man caught drinking wine on a Sunday might be fined, or worse, paraded through the bazaar, wearing the broken cup around his neck. The punishment was less about sin than about spectacle. It reminded everyone watching that the line between forgiveness and condemnation was as thin as the king's patience dot in the provinces where Sunni scholars had held their courts for generations. The campaign was harsher. Their schools were closed, their books seized, their mosques repainted with verses that bent toward the new orthodoxy. Some fled east toward the Mughal frontier, carrying fragments of libraries wrapped in cloth. Others stayed and tried to argue. The arguments ended the same way all arguments did in that decade, with silence. A scholar who once taught rhetoric at Tabriz was found hanging from his own shelves. The official report called it an act of despair. His students understood the lesson. They learned that eloquence was a dangerous appetite. Public punishments had become a kind of theater whose audience no longer needed prompting. On holy days, the square filled early, and families brought food as if to a festival. The condemned were led out in groups, accused of heresy or blasphemy, or the newer crime of doubt. The executioners worked quickly, efficient as artisans finishing a commission. Children were told to look, to remember what happened to those who questioned the unity of the faith. The older among the crowd did look, because not looking could be misread. When the dust settled and the bodies were carried away, the square returned to commerce within the hour, the stalls reopening as though blood were another form of rain. Abbas attended the ceremonies in disguise. Standing at the back where the crowd was thickest, he said later that he wished to see justice done without the distortion of flattery. What he saw was the faces of people who no longer distinguished between piety and terror. It satisfied him. He returned to the palace and told his scribes that God had shown him the true heart of his nation. Obedient, devout, unified. The scribes wrote it down exactly as he said it, because to edit was to doubt, and to doubt was to invite the same justice they had just recorded. Within the court, devotion turned ornamental. Every chamber had its niche, every niche its lamp, every lamp its verse inscribed in gold. The walls glowed with faith, even when the corridors smelled of smoke from punishments ordered an hour earlier. The king's chaplain spoke of holiness as fire, and the courtiers learned to warm their hands without flinching. They competed in displays of zeal, fasting longer, praying louder, denouncing heresy in increasingly elaborate metaphors. The king watched them as a falcon watches lesser birds, amused by their panic, reassured by their fear. Sometimes he led the prayers himself. The men of the court stood behind him, heads bowed, lips moving in unison. The chant rose and fell like wind over stone, and in that sound there was no individuality left, only the rhythm of obedience. When he turned to give the blessing, he saw not worshippers, but instruments tuned to a single note. It was a harmony built on terror, and it was beautiful in the way storms are beautiful when you are standing dry. Beneath an archway, the persecution reached the countryside more slowly, carried by caravans of inspectors and clerics who traveled with armed escorts. They entered villages and began their work of correction. The destruction of shrines deemed improper, the renaming of festivals, the conversion of local saints into approved martyrs. Resistance was rare and brief. A farmer who argued that his father's tomb had stood for 50 years found himself ordered to dig it up with his own hands. A woman who refused to abandon her pilgrimage route was beaten until she could no longer walk it. The new faith spread through exhaustion as much as conviction. At night, the king prayed alone, or said that he did. The chroniclers record him kneeling for hours, whispering verses into the air, his fingers moving through the beads as if counting nets. Servants waiting outside claimed to hear him weep, though whether from remorse or triumph, none could say. The next morning he would emerge calm, issuing new decrees for the purification of another province. The cycle repeated until the empire itself seemed to breathe in time with his guilt-inhale proclamation. Exhale punishment. In Isfahan, the preachers began to use his name in place of divine attributes. They called him the guardian, the chosen, the sword of the faith. He corrected them once, half-heartedly, and stopped correcting them at all. The flattery consoled him. It was proof that his violence had found a theology to live in. What began as politics ended as prophecy, and prophecy gave him permission to continue. Years later, travelers would write that Persia under Abbas was the most orderly kingdom in the world. They described the roads swept clean, the mosques brilliant, the people disciplined and devout. They did not mention that the roads were clean because no one dared drop what he might be accused of littering the faith with. That the mosques were brilliant because fear is an excellent polish. That discipline and devotion looked the same from a distance. A king's miracle was simple. He had turned obedience into worship and worship into a tool. The nightmare was that his subjects had learned to love the sound of their own chains being called prayer. And so the empire glittered under its holy terror, serene on the surface, hollow beneath. Every verse carved into stone, every sermon, every bowed head echoed the same thought unspoken, that to live was to agree, and to agree was to survive. In that agreement lay the quiet triumph of a man who had decided that faith itself must serve him. The fires of belief he had kindled burned too bright for truth to endure, but they lit his path, and he followed them deeper into the dark. Chapter 8. The Architecture of Fear. By the time the king began to build in earnest, cruelty had become a rhythm he no longer questioned. The empire was quiet. The borders held. The treasuries filled with the silk that passed through the hands of the displaced. He decided that beauty would complete what terror had begun. He would make the city itself a sermon and image of perfection, so overwhelming that no one would remember how it was paid for. The first stones of the new Isfahan were laid before sunrise, when the air was still cool and the streets smelled of lime and dust. The men who mixed the mortar worked without speaking. Overseers watched from scaffolds with ledgers in their hands and whips hanging beside them like punctuation. When the king visited the site, he came surrounded by clerics who spoke of divine inspiration and engineers who measured every shadow that would fall across his square. He saw not a building but a statement, order made visible. He ordered avenues straight as judgment, bridges that looked like strings drawn across the river's throat, mosques whose domes caught the sun like coins in the palm of heaven. For each perfect line, there was a crooked back somewhere out of sight. Men carried marble from quarries days away, their shoulders bleeding beneath the ropes. At dusk, when the call to prayer floated over the plain, they dropped the stones and bowed where they stood, the dust rising around them like smoke from invisible fires. The architects learned quickly that flaw was sin. One designed a minaret too slender. When it cracked under its own weight, he vanished before the next morning's inspection. Another miscalculated the spacing of tiles, and the pattern of stars across a dome stuttered. The court poet wrote that the mistake was corrected by mercy, but everyone who read the line understood that mercy had a grave outside the city walls. Those who replaced the lost craftsmen worked with the precision of men building their own safety, one chisel mark at a time. The king walked through the half-finished mosques at night. The lanterns swayed in the draft and turned the scaffolds into forests of light. He traced the geometry of the ceilings with a finger, whispering that God himself would admire such symmetry. No one answered. The masons watched from a distance, their faces hidden in the glow. They knew that a single misstep would be noticed. They also knew that beauty was the only language their ruler still understood. They built until their hands split and their tools wore down to slivers. When the great square took shape, its scale stunned even those who had conceived it. Paved with stone polished to a mirror's sheen, it reflected the sky so clearly that birds hesitated to fly across it. Around its edges rose palaces, arches, and stalls that sold the promise of paradise: silk, amber, sugar, scent. From the balconies, the king could watch his people moving like patterns in a mosaic. He told himself that they were happy because they looked small and orderly. The truth was that they moved carefully because the ground itself felt watched. Every bridge, every fountain, every colonnade bore the same design of authority, symmetry that left no room for deviation. When travelers praised the city, calling it half the world, the king smiled. He did not correct them. Half the world was exactly enough to control. The other half, what people thought, what they feared, what they whispered in the dark, was already his. The work never stopped. When the laborers faltered from exhaustion, new ones arrived, drawn from the endless supply of captives and criminals. Their pay was measured in bread, their hope in the length of a day without punishment. The overseers counted the dead with the same pens they used to tally tiles. The numbers looked clean on paper, unblemished by the stench of sweat and rot that clung to the scaffolds. The clerics blessed the project each week, sprinkling water that steamed when it hit the hot stones, promising salvation to those who built and those who ordered the building alike. Sometimes, in the middle of a sermon, the king would glance up at the vault of the mosque and feel for a moment a strange dizziness. The blue above him was endless. The gold patterns turned like wheels that never stopped. For an instant, he thought of the faces of the workers who would never see this place finished. Then the dizziness passed, and he whispered that perfection requires sacrifice. The echo answered him, a whisper shaped by the dome itself. Sacrifice, sacrifice, sacrifice. When the last scaffolds came down, Isfahan gleamed like a mirage. Visitors entered through gates that seemed to open directly into heaven. They wrote in their journals that the city was a miracle of proportion, that the Persians must be the happiest people on earth to live under such grace. They never saw the outskirts where the laborers were buried in unmarked rows, or the quarries where the wind keened through abandoned tools. They saw only the reflection of the sky in the square and mistook it for truth. At night, when the streets emptied and the fountains ran clear, the city sounded like breathing. The king stood on his balcony and listened to it. He imagined that the stones whispered prayers on his behalf. In a way, they did. Every wall, every arch, every glittering surface spoke of his need to be adored and the fear that made adoration mandatory. Beauty had become his disguise, a mask wide enough to cover the graves beneath it. He smiled, believing that no ruler in history had built so much splendor. Below, in the darkness between the buildings, the wind moved through the alleys, gathering dust and the faintest smell of sweat, and carried it out toward the desert. The desert did not answer. It had seen kings before. Chapter 9. The Dying Lion. Winter came early to Mazandaran. The sea pressed close, heavy and gray, its voice low and endless. The king had retreated there in search of air that did not taste of memory. The physicians called it fatigue. The courtiers called it pilgrimage. He called it peace. Yet the peace he found was brittle, like glass that holds its shape until a finger rests too hard against it. He woke each morning to the sound of waves beating the same rhythm as his heart. The servants said he no longer slept well. He walked the terraces before dawn, counting his steps, whispering the names of places he had conquered. When he reached the end of the list, he began again. Sometimes he spoke the names of his sons instead, and the air tightened. No one corrected him when he spoke of the dead, as though they were still waiting for orders. He had grown old without noticing. The once black beard was streaked white, his shoulders stooped, his voice softened to a growl, but the habits of command remained. He still issued decrees, sometimes contradictory, sometimes forgotten before they were sealed. Messengers hurried between the capital and the coast, carrying orders written in an unsteady hand. The ministers pretended not to see the shaking. They had learned long ago that pretending was another form of loyalty. From the windows of his seaside palace, he watched the fishermen drag their nets ashore, the same motion repeated day after day. He envied them. They worked in teams, each man trusting the pull of the others. He had spent a lifetime cutting every rope that might have held them to another. The reward was solitude. The punishment was the same. Illness narrowed his world. He ate less, spoke less, and began to confuse faces. The eunuchs whispered that he sometimes mistook them for the sons he had blinded. One morning he asked for a mirror, looked into it for a long time, and told his attendants to take it away. He said the man inside it stared with accusation. That night he ordered the mirrors in his chambers covered with cloth. He said they caught too much light. Rumors spread through the court like fog. Some said he was haunted by the ghosts of those he had judged. Servants claimed to hear voices outside his door, soft and persistent, as though someone were reciting a roll call. The physicians burned herbs to cleanse the air, and the smell of smoke became the new scent of the palace. The courtiers prayed more loudly, hoping that noise might drown the sound of approaching retribution. There were lucid hours when he tried to reason with the sickness. He called for his chroniclers and dictated fragments of history, battles won, treaties signed, cities built. He wanted to leave behind a record of greatness, something polished enough to survive him. But the scribes who took down his words noticed that the stories frayed at the edges. The victories blurred into the punishments that followed them. The names of allies merged with the names of the executed. When they asked for clarification, he frowned as though the question itself were insolent. "Write it as I say it," he told them, "so that the world will remember." The fever deepened. His days folded into one another like pages too thin to separate. The courtiers began rehearsing grief while he was still breathing. In the city, the markets grew quiet. Everyone knew that the king's breath measured the rhythm of their safety. At night, the palace corridors glowed with lamplight as doctors came and went. The sounds that leaked through the doors were not those of medicine, but of confession-murmured regrets, unfinished prayers, the voice of a man trying to bargain with the silence he had spent a lifetime enforcing. One evening he asked to be carried to the balcony. They wrapped him in furs, and he stared out at the sea. The horizon was a single line of lead. "Tell me," he said to the vizier standing behind him, "do they still fear me?" The vizier, whose wisdom had been refined by terror, answered carefully, "They revere you, Majesty." The king's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "It is the same thing," he said, and turned his face toward the wind. Before dawn, the attendants found him half conscious, whispering to someone unseen. They leaned close and heard him naming The towers of Isfahan, one by one, as if counting stars that had fallen. When his voice stopped, the only sound was the sea, endless and patient. By the time the sun rose, Shah Abbas was dead. The court mourned with the efficiency it had learned from his rule. Decrees of condolence were issued before the body was cold. The roads were lined with soldiers, banners raised, drums muted. The coffin, heavy with gold and scent, was carried south toward the capital. People knelt as it passed. Some crossed themselves in secret, others whispered blessings. Most simply, watched in silence, remembering what silence had cost them. In Isfahan, the bells of the Armenian quarter rang for him, though no one had told them to. The king's city glittered exactly as he had designed it. The domes caught the sunlight, the square shone like a mirror, the markets opened on time. From a distance, it looked perfect. Only up close could one see that the polish had begun to crack, that the gardens were overgrown, that the guards at the gates had forgotten how to stand straight when no one was watching. The empire mourned its maker and at the same time exhaled.